Yes, sir. Okay, I think it's good. Let me just check this. All right. Hello.
Hello.
Everyone doing okay?
Yes.
Good. Lovely. Wonderful. So good. I was sharing with a few of you that I just came back from some continuing education with the North Central Jurisdiction, which is the fancy word for like all the other states in our area that elect bishops. And it was just a wonderful time. It was called Innovate, which with a group called We Are Curio. And they do like leadership development. So it was wonderful. And I was sharing with another pastor who was a Korean dude out of Wisconsin, and we were having breakfast this morning, and he was asking about our context a little bit, and I was sharing that we do Bible study on Wednesday, and he's like, and he saw the commentary I was reading, he's like, oh, you guys do Bible study, and I was like, yeah, and then I showed him my slides, and he's like, you literally go through like a chapter a week, and I was like, yeah, I think it's really important, right, to have the sense of accomplishment when you're done, to be like, hey, we read the whole book of Mark, we read the whole book of Jonah, we read the whole book of Ruth, like, dude, that's 3 down, right? This is easy, just keep going. And I was sharing with others when they were coming in, I think one of my goals as a pastor in my lifetime is to have taught the entire Bible, word by word, verse by verse. It's going to take me some time.
You haven't ever taught this before, have you?
I've never taught Esther before. Yeah, so this is I'm working down my punch list, to get my brownie points. So it's so good to be with you all. A word on the handout, which if you're online, hello, it's so good to be with you, but we don't have it up here. This is from a book. What's the book called? Is the title on one of the... Is it on one of these, please? No, it's not, is it? Well, it's a mystery. Okay, it's from a book called A Brief Introduction to the Old Testament. It's published by Oxford, and it is, I think, a very concise little article. As you can tell, if you're going to try to answer the question, like, what is the Old Testament? And you can do it in 7 pages. That's pretty good, right? So I think this, for me, stemmed out of a question from a gentleman. I won't name him because we're on YouTube, but he says, right here, you all know who he is. And we were talking about why was Esther, included in the Old Testament, included in our Bible. And that got my gears turning, right? It was like, okay, and you all heard me. I said, well, there's criteria for things to be included. And then I said about proximity and dating and all these things. Not dating like, going to the movie theater, but dates, right? And so this talks a little bit about that. I think it's very, very interesting. And what I want to draw your attention to, if you have it in front of you, just really, really fast, we won't spend too long on this. I'm going to go to page 8 and 9.
But there was only 7 pages.
Well, one's, I guess there's 9 pages. Or is that 9 total? 6 pages, I think. Hey. And so you'll see it says the canons of the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament. And then it's got these big columns. Y'all tracking with me?
Yes.
Right, so on the far left is the Hebrew Bible, and it says Tanakh there. It's what it's called. The Old Testament, the Protestant Old Testament, then Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox. And you can see how they're ordered, the way that they appear in their Bibles, like in the pews, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So the Protestant one should look pretty familiar, because if you go grab a pew Bible, that's the order they're in. And you'll notice that there's some other books kind of stuck in the Roman Catholic one. They call it the Apocrypha. The Eastern Orthodox keep that as well. And that the apocryphal texts are kind of scattered in the Hebrew Bible, if they are included at all. So some things just to chew over and think about. I think it's a fantastic article. I reread it last week, and I wanted to share it with you all. I hope it's helpful. So as I shared last week, too, my goal is to sort of bring something a little extra like this every week to hand out. So if you ask a question and I maybe go on too long in Bible study, you probably expect a handout next week, because I'll be like, I better go look that up just to make sure, I'm hitting the right notes. So I hope it's helpful. Well, I've been driving all day, so all right if we begin with the word of prayer, and I can kind of calm down a bit and center for tonight's study. Sound good? Mm-hmm. Gracious Lord, we know that you continue to speak and move in the midst of our life, and that reading something like Esther chapter 2, you can move in the midst of that. So God, as we read words that might be familiar to us, or words that we encounter for the first time, we pray that you'd be in the middle of our study, that you'd be in the middle of our conversation, you'd be in the middle of our honest questions and our seeking and looking, that we might meet you there. We pray this all in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Very exciting chapter ahead of us for Esther chapter 2. And as we encountered last week, there might be some name differences for some of you who weren't here. Like, we discovered that the king's name is like Ahasuerus or something like that. But then, it could be Xerxes, and that's why, like, the King James, I think, translated as Xerxes. And it could be Artaxerxes, and we talked about the reason for that was because it's translated 3 different times in 3 different languages, and that's why you get those different changes. So, previously, on Esther, chapter 1, it ends like this. This advice pleased the king and the officials, and the king did as Mumakin proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and every people in its own language, declaring that every man should be master in his own house. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint commissioners in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in the citadel of Susa under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who's in charge of the women. Let their cosmetic treatments be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. All right, what do you notice in these first couple verses 1 through 4 of the second chapter?
He's easily influenced.
Yes. We talked about this last week, too, that the king... It's always good to ask questions about the characters, right, in the story. So, as we encounter Mordecai, what sort of marks him as a person? As we encounter Esther, what marks her as a person? Hey. As you encounter the king, what marks the king as a person? Or Vashti, what were the virtues of her as a queen? So, yeah, we picked up that the king is impressionable, which is interesting, right? Because Esther's going to make an impression on him. So isn't that interesting? It's not always a bad thing, but it can be, and certainly has been so far in the story. What else? What else do you recognize or see in the first couple of verses?
I just want to tell you something I found really interesting today. So a friend of mine on Facebook is in Branson, Missouri, and she went to see a play called Esther. It's a musical. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't know that.
That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. They had live animals and everything, she said.
Fascinating.
And it's called Queen Esther. So I guess we should take a field trip to Branson.
Wonderful, right? Stop by, get the rolls and everything.
They have a movie.
That's awesome.
Wow.
What else?
They have a movie of that.
Yeah, maybe a couple adaptations. Anything else? If not, I'll hop into a couple things that I saw. I wanted to highlight for you all. I thought this was interesting, this idea that the king remembers Vashti. He's like, oh yeah, I was married. Yeah, and then he has this moment of like, he remembers what he decreed against her. And the king's servants who attend him have this idea. So a couple things that I better refer to my notes or I'll just start talking randomly. I think it's interesting that it says that he remembered Vashti. It's unclear to me, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but it's unclear what he does to her. I think it might be presumed that he executes her, but then, correct me if I'm wrong, nowhere in the text does it say that, he killed her. It seems like the way that I read it is he set her aside. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He sort of said like,
What did it say in the first chapter about, what did the guy suggest that they do about Queen Vashti? Because I can't remember.
Well, yeah, so I think it had to do with obedience. I don't know if y'all heard the question. What did it say in the first chapter that he'd do to her?
Or with her.
Yeah.
She's never to enter the presence of the king again.
Well, that doesn't mean he killed her.
It doesn't. Yeah. But I just wanted to raise that. You know what I mean? There's times when we make assumptions when we watch a movie. You're like, oh, he's dead. Oh, but we never saw the body. And I think it can be very similar when you read the story. You're like, oh yeah, he totally killed Queen Vashti. But I don't know yet, and we don't know yet, and maybe we will by the end of the story. But I've read the whole story, and maybe some of you have as well. I still think it's unclear.
I think we never hear of her again either.
I think that's right. I think she's just not in the picture anymore. He set her aside, which is interesting. So I wanted to talk about that. And then you'll notice too that the king's servants, those 7 advisors that are named in the very beginning, they're also kind of never heard from again. So some scholars will say, yeah, he killed them because he was so upset with kind of what they had influenced him to do that he's like, okay, off with their heads, right? That old joke.
I would think it'd be more likely that he killed him because he was embarrassed in front of him because his wife did not, or the queen did not come and
Sure.
show off in front of him.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that'd be a good reason to kill them.
Yeah, and ultimately, right, we don't know. The text doesn't say. I just think it's interesting to see that there are other people now giving him advice. And the outcome is still the same, right? The king is portrayed as easily influenced, impressionable, someone who's not a virtuous, strong leader, which will come into play later because he's got some bad ideas and he's influenced in other ways.
So the way that's written, it makes me think he sort of almost maybe regrets it. He remembered her,
Mm-hmm.
and it said after his anger was abated.
Yes. He seems to have some remorse for the decision.
Yes, yeah.
You almost begin to pity this individual.
But they'd been drinking so much that
Yeah.
at the time he did everything, he might not have been thinking
Yeah.
too clearly later.
Yep. And there is a note of this is in a sober thought right now. He's come to a place of a better place of judgment. Okay, so the servant's advice is for him to seek out a concubine. And this is not really how the king would have chosen a new wife. Thank you. Right? So, all right. So you're fine. So the queen would have been chosen from one of the 7 great houses of Persia. And I have the names up here, and I'm just going to walk over here for a little bit if you're online, and I'll just read them to you. It's just flavor context. They're not mentioned in Esther, but they're known historically. And this makes sense if you think about any ruling dynasty, right? You look at, choose a European one that we're comfortable with, the House of Tudor, right? Or King Louis and the House of Bourbon. You could go on and on about the Habsburgs and all these individual houses. They married other powerful houses. And those families then, it's like, you give me, your niece and I'll get my nephew together and we'll marry, and then, we'll have a military alliance together and trade will be good between our 2 locales. So these great 7 noble families in Persia were Ishpahabudan, good luck, right? The house of Varaz, house of Karin, the house of Miran, Spandiyada, I don't speak Persian, all right, the house of Zik and the house of Surin. And then you can find all these places. They are, again, just remind ourselves that these are real places. You can travel there, and the Bible's not a fairy tale. It's real places. You can go there and stick your hands in the soil. So some of these places like Avray and Naharadan and Khorasan, they're like, oh, that's in modern day Tehran. Okay, well that city is still there, and it's always been a political stronghold, and that's where noble families have lived for a long time. And so you begin to get some appreciation for the depth of this place. So you'll notice too that it kind of straddles this area between the Caspian Sea, and this is Saudi Arabia, right? So modern day Iraq, Iran. Over here is the Mediterranean. This is Israel. And so all these spots are just different locales, and that's where those families resided. This is one of the families that the king would have selected. Then our story, of course, he decides to hold a beauty pageant and see who is the fairest of all in the kingdom, right? It's sort of the Cinderella of Cinderella stories. So we're tracking so far? All right. Now, a little bit longer bit of a text here, 5 through 11. Just also, check your translation. If there's any differences, let's talk about some of those differences. Now there was a Jew in the citadel of Susa, whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with King Jeconiah of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried away. A lot of names. He had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his cousin, for he had neither father nor mother. Am I doing this right? She had neither father nor mother. The young woman was fair and beautiful, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. When the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in the citadel of Susa in custody of Hegai, Esther had taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. The young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetic treatments and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen maids from the king's palace, and he advanced her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people or kindred, for Mordecai had charged her not to tell. Every day Mordecai would walk back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. All right. What do you see that's interesting or happening so far in this text? Or in, verses 5 through 11.
Why do you suppose Mordecai didn't want her to tell that? Would that have been because she was Jewish?
Yeah.
Would he have not wanted her because she was Jewish?
Perhaps she would have been a foreign bride, right? Where maybe we could assume, based off what we know from history, that he probably should have chosen a bride from within Persia, proper, based off the kingdoms that we already talked about this last week, right? That Persia is not like that's not what they called it, right? It was the Achaemenid Empire, and there were different dynastic families that made up that kingdom or that empire. So he probably should have chose one of those. So I think that's part of the motif of the story, is that there's some intrigue happening here.
I think maybe Mordecai knows that a Jewish girl or Jewish anybody might have a bad time
Yeah.
in this particular.
Oh, I want to stand up for a second because I was thinking about what you were saying. So let's look at it from the perspective, too. There are a lot of people that think Esther fits a particular genre of story, right? So let's come up a little bit. So when
Cinderella.
Okay, right. So, but like when you read Romans, right? It's a letter. So you read it like it's an email to a church, because that's what it is, right? When you read 1 Corinthians or Colossians, those are letters. You read them like emails. You don't read them like historical biographies.
No.
Do they contain historical aspects? Yes, but they are letters. Same with the Gospels, right? Gospels is a type of genre, so you read it as a gospel, which means good news. The authors of the Gospels are trying to convince you of something. Are there historical aspects? Yes, absolutely. And are those historical aspects true? Yes, absolutely. But ultimately, and we know this from our study of Mark, that Mark's trying to get you to believe that Jesus is the Christ. He's not writing a biopic documentary, on Jesus. He wants you to know that Jesus is the Christ, so he's telling you and trying to convince you. So what would be the genre of Esther? And it's a trick question, right? Because
the name of the book is Esther,
Yes,
and she's
come
being
on.
introduced.
Yeah, but it's not a letter, right?
It's not a fairy tale either.
Okay, it's not a fairy tale, because we know, these were real, these people existed. Even Mordecai himself, there's some archaeological evidence to suggest that Mordecai, they found Persian artifacts with this guy's name on it. Now,
Was it a popular name?
was it a popular name? Is that a coincidence?
Is this John?
Or is that just God's hand at work? Is it one of all three of those things?
Sure.
Right? So I think the genre of Esther is an important thing to consider in this particular story, because if I go up to someone and I say I'm not a white dude, it's like I can't keep my heritage a secret. In the same way, it's very doubtful that someone could look at a Jewish woman in this time and say, I don't know what you are. By virtue of her being a Jew, you can't marry outside of the Jewish clans. So those strong racial traits that are associated with the Jewish people, she would have looked like a Jewish woman. So it's part of the storytelling motif, sort of the intrigue, the core intrigue, that Mordecai's like, don't tell anybody your heritage. Sort of setting us up for what's to come in the story. Is that helpful to think about a little bit?
My commentary talks about that quite a bit, and it talks about how there are a lot of historical details, but that it's most commonly labeled a court tale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard it called like court intrigue,
Yeah.
which is interesting. If you look at other commentators, it's firmly in the historical section of the Bible, and so it's Job. Yeah, the next one is Job, and Job begins the wisdom section of the Bible, which is also in the handout we saw. So genre is important, but it's not the deciding factor on all of our interpretation. Just something to consider. Okay, so great eyes. What else? Does everyone have Hadassah in their translation?
No,
Yes?
That's her Jewish.
Yeah, okay. So there are some manuscripts that don't have it because it's not in, let me get my notes right.
Yeah, I do see it.
Does yours have it?
it's Esther's Hebrew name.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's not in the Greek translation, so it's only in the Hebrew. So when they translated the Hebrew text to the Greek, they didn't put Hadassah in. Just something to consider. So yeah, a couple things I saw. One is talking about Susa. What was that? Talking about Mordecai and Benjamite. Who is King Jeconiah, and then we'll talk about Esther. I love this idea of her portion of food, and then not revealing her people and who she is.
Does that mean he put her on a diet?
So
A special day.
it's important. Yeah, her diet is important, right? Because we know that Jews keep kosher.
Would she?
It does make treatment that she had to go through the link, which I was surprised on how the text.
Yeah, right. Maybe it's Maybelline. So it's yeah, it takes a while.
What was the beauty treatments?
Yeah, it's a little exaggerated, I think, but
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so we'll talk about Susa for a second. We'll remember that Susa is the capital of the Persian Empire. It's an important city in the ancient Near East, and that's about all I'll say from that, except for this. The English name Susa is derived from the Greek Sousa, S-O-U-S-A, which is ultimately derived from the Elamite name, Susan, S-U-S-N. And brownie points if anyone knows who Elam is. I was like, that name sounds really familiar to me, and then I had to look it up.
Tell us.
Elam is the son of Shem, who's the son of Noah,
Yeah, okay.
right? And believe it or not, there's a language called Elamite. It's a real thing. I just want to when I was it's cuneiform. Excuse me, I'm going to disappear again. This is called cuneiform when it looks like triangles and dashes and slashes. It's a cuneiform, which is a family of languages. So Sumerian is written in cuneiform. Some of these ancient Babylonian texts are written in cuneiform. We're going to talk about these two tablets and why they're important because they have to do with the story of Esther. And then there are tablets written in even more ancient cuneiform, which they call Elam, which is a son of Noah. It's called prehistory. That's how old it is. You know what I mean? The language is dead. No one can read it. No one speaks it. It's just classified as that. But I just thought that was fascinating and somewhat beautiful. So Mordecai, he's a Benjamite, right? He's not from the tribe of Judah, and that's also why he gets that little epitaph, the Jew, Mordecai. Because if he was from the tribe of Judah, he'd probably be called a Hebrew or something different. So there's a little bit of differentiation in the name in that story. So the Babylonian exile, that's that first tablet on the left, happened around 597 BC, all the way up to 587 BC. And the Babylonian Chronicles, there's about 45 tablets that record Babylonian capture of the Jewish folk. And the one on the left talks about Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Jerusalem and his capture of Jeconiah. That's the dude in our story, right, who Mordecai served under. His appointment of Zedekiah in his place and the plundering of the city in 597 BC. And they are corroborated by the passage of the Babylonian Chronicles, which I think are fascinating. So we'll come back to that. Oh, no. Sorry, I jumped ahead too soon. So I think that was fascinating. The one on the right here is called Jehoiakim's Rations Tablets, and it talks about the king Jehoiakim, who's the king of Judah, and is taken into Babylonian captivity.
And we
So-
were just talking about that in Sunday school.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So when you read that, you'll help me here. Where's it at? It's verse 5. Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with King Jeconiah of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried away. So that's in the Bible, right? People are like, yeah. But then you find tablets like this in the ground that have the exact same information, and you go, oh, yeah.
Man.
It's not made up. It's not made up. It's there.
Not like Joseph's plates in the what is that religion now?
Mormon.
Oh,
Mormon.
yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
The plates in the ground.
I
Yeah, there
knew
you go.
Richard would remember.
So Esther's Jewish name is Hadassah. It means myrtle. And so Esther is her Persian name. And it's pretty common, right? I think I've told you all the story that I used to work at a Korean church. And I'll never forget, my student told me his name was Brian. And then one day someone called him something else. And I was like, what did he just call you in Korean? He goes, that's my name. I said, no, it's not. Your name's Brian. He goes, no, that's my English name. And I was like, oh, you tricky guy. It's the same thing, right? Turns out if we were all spirited away to Russia, we'd probably all take Russian names. And if we were all, taken captive to, I don't know, Mozambique, we'd get Mozambican names, And we would just...
If I was to go to Russia, I'd be Dorothea.
That's right, yeah. You adopt the culture of the place you're in. So I'm going to say that one more time. You adopt the culture of the place you're in.
Oh, and Jeremiah told them to do that.
Okay, so there are a number of biblical characters who are taken into exile, and let's hear the echoes of these stories in our story with Esther. Let's brainstorm together. Who were the biblical characters who end up somewhere else?
Well, Abraham was first.
Yeah, Abraham takes a big pilgrimage and journey. He leaves Ur, right, and he goes to the promised land. Daniel.
And
Moses.
yeah.
Joseph ends up in Egypt, right? And here are the stories in particular of Daniel and Joseph.
And 2 Josephs went to Egypt.
Yeah, that's important. So Daniel ends up in a high court position.
Right.
Joseph ends up in a high court position. So there's echoes of this sort of Jewish person, I can't talk, Jewish person taken away from home who ends up with responsibility. Daniel, Joseph, and Esther. She falls in that tradition as well. Daniel ends up in Babylonian captivity, which is a part of the Persian narrative. So Daniel and Esther share that as well. So we go back here real fast. So it says that in verse 9, he quickly provided her with her cosmetic treatments and her portion of food. This is that echo that she is given food to eat. And in Daniel, right, you all know that Daniel, you'll remember, he is told to keep kosher. So what sets him apart is he doesn't eat the Babylonian food. He keeps kosher. Here, Esther does not. She partakes of the culture that she's in the middle of, which is interesting. Just a distinction to be aware of.
I wonder if she thought it was good.
I don't know.
Well, my Bible says that she does not observe the dietary laws, perhaps in part to conceal her Jewish identity.
Yeah, it could be part of the intrigue portion of the theme of the text. Real fast, Esther is a Persian name. It could be derived from the goddess Ishtar or a Persian name for the word for star. Ultimately, they don't know. I just thought it was kind of interesting. And I thought the echoes of the foreign courts of Joseph and Daniel were interesting as well, and her rations. Another thing about the food to come, right? Some people will see that Esther partaking of her portion of food is that's going to be a major theme in Esther in chapter 9 with Purim and the food that they have. And so there's this also motif of food and how do they engage in the eating process. And we already saw that in chapter 1 with all the abundance of food and wine. And so it's another motif in the story. All right, doing okay?
One more little King Saul was a Benjamite. His father was named Kish.
Was who?
King Saul
Oh, King Saul?
was a Benjamite, and his father was named Kish.
Yes. And I wonder if that's...
Mordecai was a Benjamite, and his father was named. These things interest me.
No, yeah. I don't know if y'all heard what she said, that King Saul's father was a Benjamite named Kish, and that there's a connection in the story. Now, whether or not it's the same one, you got to get some paper and do some dating and drawing and all that.
That could never be.
Yeah. Okay.
They were 500 years apart.
So in verse 12 it says, "The turn came for each young woman to go into the king. Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their cosmetic treatments," man, they're all about this.
Yeah.
6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics for women. When the young woman went into the king, she was given whatever she asked for to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she went in, then in the morning she came back to the second harem in custody of Shahashagaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She did not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name.
So she went early?
She went when she was called, summoned, but not by name, right? It's on her schedule.
Number 64.
Yeah, right? Take a number. You're next. I just think it's important to wrestle. I don't know about you all. I'll just be really honest and open with many of you, right? I was raised in a house that didn't really talk about intimacy issus, we didn't talk about sex, and then I found as you get older and you read the Bible, you're like, man, this is everywhere. This is how did we skip these parts of the Bible, I never got this little flannel board lesson in Sunday school, and so, if you try and read this and say like, oh, there's no sexual undertones in the story, are we reading the same story here, and we should just pause for a second, because you think about Esther's role. And we've talked about this a lot, right? She has no power. She is completely at the whim of somebody else. And there are still people like this in the world, right? And ultimately, we're gonna wrestle with Esther's role in the story. She is the main character. We feel all the emotional tension in the story through Esther's position. And then interestingly enough, or in contrast, we see all the action take place by all the men. And maybe ladies are saying, not much has changed, but then we take the brunt of all the decisions and we have to deal with it. And I think Esther, let's remember, this is an old story. And yet, how modern is it as well for our ears and eyes?
Well, but she also obeys Mordecai.
She does.
He said, don't tell. She didn't. She did.
Yes. Yeah. And that relationship and ongoing relationship will become important right to the story. And we'll see it also play out in the rest of this chapter as well. There's still more to their relationship, right? This don't tell. Oh, okay, now tell him. And then she also reveals, and it was Mordecai who told me. Oh, okay. So there's this triangulation of relationship that happens. So myrrh comes from this plant. I'm not going to bore you with the Latin name, even though it's something I would totally do. I can't pronounce it. And it's native to the Near East. Myrrh is a resin. So the way you get a resin is you bleed the plant, right? Like sap. Sap is a resin. So that pine tree seeps out and then gets all hard and chonky. That's what myrrh is. And myrrh has a million uses. And it's used a lot in the Bible. But there's a couple different things. So Joseph and his brothers, they take myrrh to Egypt. Myrrh is used in the consecration of the first and second temple. It's also a purification ritual here in Esther 2. It's also maybe seen as an aphrodisiac. It's mentioned a lot in Song of Solomon. It's mentioned in Proverbs. It's mentioned in Psalms in a romantic way.
It's one of the 3 gifts.
It is one of the 3 gifts given to Jesus. It's also one of the. It's thought that myrrh and vinegar wine were mixed together and offered to him on the cross. And then it's also thought that this is what Joseph of Arimathea would have used to kind of put over the body as well. So it's an important ancient thing. What do you call it? Resin, spice or perfume, right? Ointment. And I think that's interesting that it plays a role in our story. The myrrh is also associated in Ezekiel, Ruth, and Judith. And so you find it in Judith a lot because it's also a contemporary of Esther, the sort of court intrigue or court romance story. So, doing well? Okay. 15 through 18. When the turn came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was admired by all who saw her. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favor and devotion. Just pause there for a moment, right? And I know I'm interrupting the flow of the text, and we talked about this last week. She's a virgin concubine, which does not make sense, but okay, we're going to just hold that there. So that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet to all his officials and ministers, Esther's banquet. He also granted a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts with royal liberality. What do you see? Questions you might have?
What happened to all the other?
Concubines?
Yeah.
I'm sure they were still there.
And they never had a life of their own.
Yeah.
Do you think that was to separate them from the women of the night in towns and
Interesting.
give them a different title because they were of the king,
The royal
the
concubines?
royal concubine?
Yes. So last week we talked about the role of the harem, right? And how the harem was not just, I'm going to be very crass. Is that okay? So we just kind of be clear and cut. The harem was not a whorehouse, right? The harem was a place of safety for women. So there were women of the royal family who were maybe not of marrying age who would be admitted into the harem. Of course, the king knew that you could not sleep with those women, right? Because you'd spoil your dowry and all those things. And they were also family and kin. And I know the ancients had different understandings of familial relations than we do. But I do think that the harem was in the palace proper. It was women who the king could choose to sleep with, should the king desire. And now whether or not the king, went out on the town and had women of the night, I don't know. It's not a part of the story. But I do know that the harem was a special place and guarded by eunuchs who were trusted.
Well, I was just wondering between the peoples, the common people,
Yeah.
and the nobles, so that the nobles knew those were all women because those were the king's harem.
I'm sure they knew it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. And we know that there are a number of guards who kind of watch over them. And it's also we're going to look at Mordecai's role. Because Mordecai, maybe we already read this, that he's allowed to sort of walk around and be near the harem. Which, we're going to ask the question, why is he allowed to do that? Okay, great thoughts so far. Yep.
Okay, but the concubines in the harem were available to the king, but they would not have been chosen to be the queen.
That's correct.
Because he chose a virgin. And so the virgins would have been chosen, the concubines obviously were not, and they would have never been chosen as queen, so the virgins were chosen because of their virginity.
Yeah, in the purity, right, yeah. There's some other themes I want to draw our attention to in this particular passage as well, right? We see some echoes of chapter 1. So in verse 17 it says, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favor and devotion. So he set the royal crown on her head. And you remember from chapter 1, we debated what was it when he asked Queen Vashti to appear with the crown on her head. So you have this sort of like, well, if she won't do it, Esther will, right? And so Esther gets the crown, and she's beautiful. We know that Vashti was beautiful. That's why he was calling her in the first place, so that everyone could behold her beauty. And here's Esther, also beautiful. And so there's Vashti and Esther are seen as sort of these, I don't know, one side of the coin, right? They are the women characters that are at the women of this king. And then, yeah, it says that he made her queen instead of Vashti. Notice that it doesn't say anything about marriage. There's no, and people talk about this a lot, and you read different commentaries, that it's thought that she's just elevated to a place of honor. Because there's no way he could marry her. It would, that's not how it works. Unless you're Cinderella. He would have had to marry some sort of royal woman. Or,
well, if he was like Solomon or David, have all the queens you want.
Yes. Yeah, you can have lots of different wives. Okay. Notice too, it says the 10th month, which is the month of Tebet. I know we've talked about this at Ruth. I'm just going to make us do it again. It's good. And I had to look it back up. Right? They don't use the Gregorian calendar in Judaism. Right? They're on a lunar cycle. They have different months. So the 10th month of Tebet really is like January. You would think it would be like October. No, that would be too easy. It's got to be more complicated. So Tebet or Tebet. If you always see a B or a V in Hebrew, they're interchangeable, just so you know. And so Tebet is pronounced Tebet or Tebet. It's the same thing, the same sound. That's right between December and January. And so this is when this is taking place, which I'm sure is a lovely time of year in Persia. Very nice.
Yeah.
All right. This will take us home, right? 23 to take us to the end. When the virgins were being gathered together, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her kindred or her people. We talked about this. As Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and conspired to kill King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes. But the matter came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, both men were hung on the pole. It was recorded in the book of the Annals in the presence of the king. I had to pause for a moment because I just had a realization that I didn't write down on my notes. And I'm going to say it before I forget it. Is that fair?
Yeah, sure.
I just realized, and I don't know why it just didn't come up in my commentaries. Let's play some sort of historical game. Let's say we were all sent into exile and it's 1942 and we're sitting in Berlin and I'm in charge of something in Hitler's palace, and then I hear of a plot to kill Hitler. I may not say something. You know what I mean? And I don't know why I didn't think about that. And maybe you all saw it immediately, but they're in exile. Like, their enemy has taken them out of their homeland. And the king, like, the chief enemy is going to be murdered. Oh no! But they tell him of the assassination plot. Huh! I mean, that's interesting. Maybe I'm alone. What do you, okay. What do you think? Okay.
Where's the food coming from?
Perhaps to gain favor.
Who's feeding them?
Who's feeding who?
Who's feeding Mordecai?
I don't know. He's a part of. So he's sitting at the king's gate. So the people who would sit at the king's gate would have been officials.
Yeah.
So Mordecai is a part of the royal court. He's an official. He has a title. He has access to the king and things around the palace. And
If anything happened to the king, then Esther would have been in danger.
Okay, interesting.
So that has to be why he would pass that information on, to protect her.
Yeah.
By that time, she was already queen, so now he is invested in this. So why would you not? I mean, I guess he could have that hatred, but why would he try to get his queen in there unless...
Yeah. And I also saw it also as an example of righteousness. In my kind of aha moment, that maybe the reason why he tells the king of the assassination attempt is because it is the right thing to do, right? Ultimately, we are to protect life at all costs. I don't know, just something to think about. What else do you notice?
Public execution?
Public execution, yeah. It's well attested. And that's my final slide, just because it's kind of interesting, and it's not too graphic. But there are Persian engravings And they are specifically Persian engravings of Jewish people being impaled.
Sure.
When the Persians conquered different cities, they would have, after they made an example of you. And I'll just scroll off that because I don't want to stare at it. So, it's interesting to note, too, that it's thought that the impalement was sort of the example-making part. That's not the execution. They probably would have killed you and then impaled you. And this happens with Saul. Saul is impaled and hung on a wall. And then, here, these individuals are as well. Just, it's important to recognize from a historical standpoint kind of what's happening in the story, because it's going to come up again. So,
Are you saying King Saul was hung on a wall?
mm-hmm, his body was.
I don't remember
In
that.
1 Samuel 31, y'all, are we betting? What's the over under? 1 Samuel 31:7. Teen?
I know he was put aside, but I didn't know he was killed.
Yeah, there it is, verse 10. So they put his armor in the temple of Astarte, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan.
Oh.
And the only way you can fasten a body to a wall is if you impale it.
Yep. One way or the other.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That must have been when we were talking about
Sorry?
Virgin olive oil.
Yeah, no, yep, a little bit of Velcro, just right there. Okay, so what do you think so far? What's happening? Oh, let's talk about Mordecai just a second more, and some thoughts on him. So we already said that he's positioned at the gate, which is why he overhears the matter, and then he has access to the harem, so he's trusted, and he has access in other parts of the story to other areas, to other officials. It is thought that Mordecai is part of the king's secret police in the story. That's the only thing that sort of makes sense, that he has access to all these places and is given access so he can hear the comings and goings of the town, and then he can report to the king what is happening. Not a whole lot of other professions make sense in terms of his level of access. Like a common merchant or trader who's sitting at the town gate would not have access to the harem. And the reason why he has access to the harem is because those women know everything. So, they can tell him and he'll tell the king, so on and so forth.
That endears him to the king.
It does. It does. And that'll be a part that comes into play later. So, if you were to summarize chapters 1 and 2 so far, what do you think the story of Esther is about? You'll notice there's still no talk of God, which is interesting. Who are the main players? Let's summarize for ourselves. What do we know?
Xerxes.
Yep, we got the Persian king, Mordecai, who's Esther's uncle,
And Esther.
and Vashti, yeah, the queen, the ex-queen.
Esther.
Yeah. There's some background noise. So some of the background noise would be like there's the harem, the women there, and the eunuchs.
Hey, guy.
And yes, the other names dropped every now and then, which always confused me as the reader. I'm like, oh, is that important? Should I remember that? There seems to be like someone in charge of the harem. There's a guard here, and then there's like the advisors, but they kind of flow in and out of the story at different times.
There's a special unit that loved her best, that liked her best.
Yes, and he gives her advice. Okay.
I thought it was interesting that Mordecai was able to get to the queen to tell her the story,
Yes.
because you would think that he would have to have a special
Permit.
permit.
Yeah, no, exactly right. Don't have security clearance to come in here, which is why people will say he's probably part of the secret police, because he does have her ear, and it's not just because they're family. It doesn't appear to be just because they're family. It's like that's not how it would work. For him to have access like he does, he has to have some sort of badge. Other thoughts, questions?
There's people jealous of him,
Yeah.
very jealous of him.
I think the other thing is, says Esther told the king, well, I thought the king has to call you in You can't just go to the king and say that.
Yeah, you have to be summoned.
They left that out in this particular
They
spot.
did. That one didn't make the cut. Yeah.
So she did somehow get word to the king that there was
She did.
a plot.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's where we'll leave it. I know it's like right in the middle of a story. Right? It's kind of weird to like, chop it off right there, but if we kept reading more and more chapters, we'd all fall asleep, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Must have been something special for him to do something for her.
Yeah. Yeah, very
It's an
interesting so
interesting
far.
place to stop too. It's like a cliffhanger.
Yeah. All right. So I'll ask another question for you to just wrestle with, and I'm going to keep asking this sort of every week and this is a question that I think you ask in your faith journey. It's a question I think is really applicable in Esther. I talked about last week. I'm to ask that question like, well, where is God? Where is God in the story? And oftentimes our jobs, right, is to look for God breaking into the world. Is to say, I see God at work at my work, or I see God at work in my grandkids, or I see God at work in my neighborhood, or I see God at work at the corner county line in Madison. Man, sometimes it's hard to see God, and so it's a helpful exercise to look at the story of Esther and ask this question. So I'll probably ask that question at the end of every chapter, just for us to wrestle with it. Okay, I'm going to offer a word of prayer, and then I'll linger. If you have some questions and thoughts, we can work through some things. All right, let's pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the story of Esther, for its historical significance, its spiritual significance, and its formation on us. As we go home and we get some rest, Lord, we pray that you would continue to inform and impress on our minds the significance of this story. We pray this all in your Son's name. Amen.
So it's what months of husband period?